that you guys put in the Slack. This is going to be fun. Gave me a lot to think about as I was going through these. And I was like, oh yeah, I know the answer to this. And then I think like, I'm definitely one of those types of people who like, if I don't have the answer, I'm totally comfortable saying, I don't know, but I will do my best to find out. So I'm going to preface this with that. And also specifically, Andrew, your question about shoes and pronation, I'm really fascinated by and also don't know. So I did what I could. But I also like took it a step further, maybe too far. We'll find out. Um, but in 2 weeks, we're going to have like a shoe expert come on and answer your questions specifically, as well as go through how to choose the right shoe for you, what pronation means, what underpronation means. And then I'm going to connect you guys with a PT who does remote gait analysis. So there will be lots of resources for that one question, which I hope is helpful. I think it'll be helpful. I don't know. We'll find out. Okay. Does anyone have any initial questions before I dive in? I just buy the shoes that look the fastest too. Yeah. I'm #influenced easily. I just bought a pair of Agravic Speed Ultras and I'm like, I'm going to be so fast now. So yes. And brighter, faster. Absolutely. Yes, yes, yes. Cool. I'm going to jump in. I've got a Google Doc that I'm going to be kind of like taking notes out of as I go through these. I bucketed these into different themes. So there's a shoe theme, there's a nutrition theme, there's a training theme, there's a mental performance theme. And if at any point you guys want me to stop or have questions, like don't feel like you have to like hit the raise your hand feature on here, just interrupt me. We can have like a conversation about this stuff. So with that said, I'm going to jump in. We had a question about post-exercise ketones and pre-exercise bicarbonate. This is really interesting. So if you listen to the Coopcast and you listen to the SWAP podcast, they both have talked about this. And there's a lot of science, a lot of conversations happening around these two topics right now. So with post-exercise ketones, the research has suggested that ketones could aid in recovery by enhancing muscle repair and reducing cognitive fatigue, which can be beneficial if you're like mentally and physically overreaching, but we're not sure what the long-term effects are. They're like, all of those things are still under study. So it could be, we could be getting served an infomercial in 10 years, you know, offering financial assistance. So we'll hold out there. But yeah, so good, but taken with a grain of salt. They're also expensive. So there's that. And then when it comes to pre-exercise bicarbonate is basically baking soda. So from both like, I guess like a physiological perspective, it could enhance like high intensity efforts because there's like a delay of the onset fatigue through lactic acid buffering. And that's kind of what the hype around pre-exercise bicarbonate is. It's just a delaying the onset of fatigue. So with that, like the risks there are gastrointestinal distress, which could disrupt your focus, could disrupt confidence, could disrupt a whole race. You could literally blow up. That's an exaggeration, obviously, but it's not going to feel great if you're not used to it. So that's definitely something worth practicing in training ahead of time. Also, this is incredibly expensive. Any like easy Google search, like these might be out of reach. Like, I don't know if I would mess with these quite yet until there's more research, but
Also
yeah.
heard it's a little unpleasant to do. Like just
Yeah.
not an enjoyable experience to get down.
No, I mean, it's basically just a dry scoop of baking soda in a lot of ways, which would not recommend. I mean, at this point you're chasing marginal gains, and if you have to do that to like PR by like a minute, couple seconds, whatever it is in whatever event, then like that's worth asking like Is it worth it? Because it sounds awful, but to each their own. So also again, like expensive, but I think like looking at both of these things as tools within a toolbox, I think the integration of them should align with like the athlete's goals, the athlete's needs, and again, like having them in your regimen and like practicing with ahead of time. Because if this is like a new thing on race day, it's not going to go well. Like it's just not. So, okay. Any questions on that? Any thoughts? Run fast, don't explode. Cool. All right, the next question is the shoe theme. So again, we're going to talk about this with like an expert. So the question that Andrew sent in, how much is it worth thinking about pronation tendencies when looking at shoes? And then having had some instances where matching seems to help, but long runs have been on trail shoes that don't match what a shoe store would typically recommend. So it is less about the category and more about the individual shoe. So that's like the TLDR, like you answered it within your question. And a lot of the answer to this is it's always going to be it depends because trail shoes don't align perfectly with road shoe categories like neutral or stability. But runners still perform well in them. So basically, when selecting shoes on pronation tendencies, research has shown, and I will share the studies in the Slack. So research has shown that while overpronation and supination are relevant, they aren't always the sole determinants for injury prevention or performance based on shoe. A lot of times you hear athletes saying like, I hate that shoe, it injured me, or I got injured wearing that shoe. Sometimes true, but also it depends. So one way to alleviate this is getting a gait analysis done. And those are useful to understand your movement patterns, like cadence, form, like are you hunched over? What is the correct angle that you're running at? Like what is that looking like? And that's going to have more to do with injury prevention than the actual shoe. So I think like what matters most here is how your body responds to the shoe during the run. And if you find a shoe that works for you, if you find a shoe that feels comfortable and fits well, especially on varied terrain, like if you're going to be running on trails or gravel or even sometimes road, like use that shoe. One of my favorite shoes was they don't make it anymore, but it was the Salomon Sense Pro Max. And it was such a good do-it-all shoe. I would wear it on trails. I raced a half marathon on the roads in it, and it just was like a really well-rounded shoe. But they don't make it anymore. So I'm interested to talk to our expert, Jeremy, in a couple of weeks and have him sort of like break down what to look for when looking for like a do-it-all shoe. But then when we're talking about road shoes, it's going to be a little bit different because a lot of times when we select shoes based on pronation tendencies with road shoes, the reps in the running stores like are taught to prescribe specific shoes. So it's a little bit different. I feel like the expertise, the research, the science isn't really there yet for trail specific shoes, but we're getting closer, which is exciting. So I know I didn't answer that, and I hate when the answer is always it depends, but it kind of does in this case.
Yeah, I think this one is just helpful. You go into the shoe store and they're like, okay, well, it's like these three options. And you're like, well, I don't like any of these three options, right? And it's like, well, okay, I can try the other options. Like my feet aren't going to explode when I put that neutral shoe on and go for a run in it. But I'm not sure if anyone else has had that experience that, walking into the shoe store and they kind of make it seem like it's a very buttoned up thing. And then I was like, like, I bought some New Balance that I've been running in. I have no idea what they are. They could be support, they could not be. They feel great. So that's why I was like, okay, maybe I need to stop overthinking this quite as much.
Yeah, every shoe store I've been to, like running shoe store, they always try to push a brand on you. And they say it's like the best shoe for you. they always try to push like ultras on me for road running, which I don't understand, but
Oh,
yeah.
no.
And I don't like them either, but like they're like, oh yeah, these are the best shoes ever. Like, don't use Saucony. These are amazing. And but that happens everywhere. Like every different shoe store has a different brand that they're probably getting incentives to push on you.
Yeah, I think one piece of like really good life advice that I've gotten when it comes to walking into shoe stores is to tell them I am easily overwhelmed. Like, don't over explain, don't push, but just like help me understand what's going to work best for me. And if you go into like a specialty running shop, they'll be able to do a gait analysis there. They'll have a treadmill set up with a camera set up and they'll be able to walk you through it. But yeah, that overwhelm is a very common experience. And it makes me like angry sometimes. You sometimes, especially if you like kind of know what you want, and but you kind of have to like dumb it down a little more to explain what you're looking for, it gets frustrating. But in my experience, I found that just being honest and just being like, I'm easily overwhelmed when it comes to multiple options. Like if you can streamline it, let's do it. Um, take it or leave it. That it's worked well for me. But there's also times where I've like totally geeked out over shoes with the sales rep. So, depends on the time I have and depends on the cycle of the moon, I suppose. I don't know. Every other full moon it works out. So, cool. The next bucket of questions is training questions. So I'm just going to go through these. I think there's a lot of really good stuff in here that we have touched on tangentially before, but we've never really dove into. So question number 1, what determines training volume? Is the general principle that higher volume leads to faster races true? No. Quick answer, no. Is the theory you should have the same weekly mileage as your race distance outdated? Yes. Quick answer. And then how do you determine an optimal weekly volume in the off season? Such a good question. So training volume is critical for the like athletic and endurance development for any athlete, but it should always be tailored to the athlete rather than like strictly formulas. So like while there are a lot of formulas, if you're looking at like the Jack Daniel's running formula is actually like the book title. It's so individualized. So like there's not a one size fits all formula. There's not a one size fits all plan. So while the belief that like higher volume leads to faster races, that holds some truth, it doesn't hold all of the truth. There is no one size fits all solution there. So basically your performance is going to rely on the balance of volume, intensity, recovery, and stress. So like when we talk about stress is stress is stress, that's like the balance of everything. And like my job as a coach is just equally distribute stress throughout your week to keep things sustainable. So the old theory that weekly mileage should match your race distance is definitely outdated. Instead, one thing to keep in mind is that like your optimal weekly mileage should account for that specific athlete's current fitness, long-term goals, and overall health and like stress levels, right?
Can I ask, is there a specific metric that you're looking at to, say like this is working or not, or is it just like how good did they do on race day?
No, it's definitely not how they do on race day. Like a lot of times in Training Peaks, I'm breaking down and like looking at the analysis of long runs, of easy runs, and of your speed workouts. So if an athlete can't hit a target pace or zone, or if I can see that they're frequently running an easy run too fast, then we're gonna have to like adjust some things. So it kind of is across the board. But what I can see, and I think that like you can see it too in Training Peaks when you go into like the analysis button, when you open up the workout, you can sort of see what the target is and what the actual pace is. And that's really helpful for me as a coach to see too, because I can adjust zones, I can adjust threshold paces from there. But with that, if I can see that an athlete is overreaching or if I'm seeing a lot of comments that are like, this felt terrible, I feel tired, that's when we need to pull back and sort of find a better balance.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So that kind of like leads into these like the conversation of off season, and like what the weekly volume in the off season should be like. And so basically the three things there to keep in consideration are your recovery needs, your long-term goals, and balance, which includes like a variety of activities, not just running. So with recovery, that like these are the prime months, like while you're still going to be running, like off season doesn't mean no running. It just means this is a good time to let your body recover from the demands of peak season. So we're going to reduce volume significantly. We're going to add in more cross training, and we're going to talk about long-term goals, right? So we're going to tailor that volume to reflect where you want to be in the upcoming season, or upcoming races. So when we sit down and talk about goals and race planning, these are the things we're going to like, that I'm going to use when building out your off season. I hate the word off season, but you know what I mean? So we're just going to make sure that we can get you prepared without overreaching, basically. So if you've got your first 100-miler on the calendar, if you've got an A race for a road marathon on the calendar, we're not going to be doing 50-milers in the off season, right? Like if you're trying to qualify for Boston, especially now with the new standards, like we're going to we're basically going to like reset the foundation to set you up for long-term success. So with that, a lot of times you get athletes in the off season who are like, can't even wrap their head around running like 5 days a week. Totally normal, totally okay, because it's the off season. So we're going to add in swimming or biking or yoga or any form of low impact cross training. Focus on strength. Like the off season is a great time to build speed and strength through strength training, as a way to like maintain balance so that you're not mentally burnt out, but you're like physically fresh as well. So that when you do enter that next competition block or foundation block, build block, endurance block, speed block, there's all sorts of blocks. You feel ready for it and excited, and you're not dragging your feet to get started. So does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions about that? Cool. No, Matt, you did not ask too many questions. Like, keep them coming. Okay, so this question came from Chris, and he asked me this in person a few times last weekend. So what is the thought process behind afternoon doubles? And rather than just doing long runs during the week, is it to be mindful of our work schedules, or is it strategic? It is strategic. So the strategy behind afternoon doubles extends beyond work schedules, right? So like when we're talking about building durability and like physiological, like from a physiological standpoint, doubles can promote greater aerobic adaptation because it stimulates mitochondrial development, which is like a big, scary, sciencey word, but basically it helps improve recovery speed and it enhances our body's ability to process fatigue. So I know I've talked a lot about fatigue resistance, like this is for that. So by splitting sessions into 2 parts, we are allowing for more quality miles without excessive fatigue from one single long run. So these can also help like maintain mental freshness, especially during high volume training cycles. So if you're doing like 60 miles a week and you're doing a double 1 to 2 days a week, like being able to balance your runs with a double instead of like planning out like, oh, I'm going to have to run for 2 hours today, I'm going to get it all done at once. Like that's kind of mentally exhausting and it's really hard to plan for. So it's both strategic and like scientific in a lot of ways. Thoughts on intuitive training? This question, Natasha, I'm really glad that you asked it. I went into a deep dive on the interwebs for this because there's intuitive eating, there's intuitive sleeping, there's all sorts of like ways to do this. So intuitive running training, intuitive training can yield impressive results. It has before. So like, especially as you experienced in your triathlon, Natasha. So recent research on intuitive training basically highlights the potential for fostering better body awareness, and like feeling and understanding your adaptation to stress, flexibility, and adjusting to like physical and mental demands of training. However, it also requires a high intrinsic motivation and like a deep sense of self-accountability. So without a lot of intrinsic motivation and a lot of self-accountability, a lot of athletes will tend to undertrain or overtrain and neglect proper recovery. So if you're thinking about intuitive training, really ask yourself and sort of like be honest with yourself and like think about like how self-accountable you are, how high or low your motivation is. So like the tough thing about intrinsic motivation is that like if you run 1 day a week, like there's something to be said for consistency. So if you're not consistent and then you run 1 day a week, it's going to feel awful and you're not going to be motivated to run the next day. So you'll likely push it off and then you'll start to associate running with feeling awful and then your motivation goes down. So I think it's great for other things, but for training, it's a little trickier. And like as a coach, that would be hard to schedule for, not impossible. But I think in an off season, having a lot more flexibility and autonomy to choose distances is a lot more mentally refreshing. There's like a time and place for it, but I don't think it should be a plan like year round, if that makes sense. So, but this was a really good question. All right. Next question. I think this came from Jacob, was how to determine vert and or slash elevation in training. And is there a rough formula for a vert per week? Yes, this is super strategic. So this is a very strategic balance, because it should align with the demands of your specific race. There's not a set formula, but there's a lot of data that suggests that focusing on race specific vert and aiming between 80 to 100% of your race's vert in your key long runs or within your weekly mileage, depending on your life stress, life schedule, how much time you have throughout the week to train, aiming for 80 to 100% of that vert is really beneficial. So for more mountainous races, if you're doing something like Tushers or Orcas, it's really important to incorporate vert progressively, just as you would with mileage, and like so that you don't get injured. A lot of athletes, when they sign up for a mountain race and haven't been doing a lot of vert and just, go from like 700 feet of climbing per week to 7,000 feet of climbing per week, like your body's going to be talking to you. If things aren't going to feel right, your Achilles is going to get real tight. Your increased risk of injuries like goes through the roof. So that's why like when we sign up for these races, it's great to have like 3+ months to prepare for them so that we can increase that vert load. But also the terrain variability and fitness of the athlete matters a lot too. So in some cases, if you're aiming for like, you can aim for 10 to 15% of total race vert weekly, and that to start, that provides like a sustainable target without overloading the body. And then tailoring your vert to personal capacity, recovery needs, race goals, that's also really important. So basically my job here is to make sure that you're not under or overloading yourself and finding that balance, because some athletes are going to be able to like hit the ground running and just start running straight up mountains and it's going to be totally fine. Like Andrew, you're the perfect example of this. Like he's good. I'm never too worried. And then if and when, because things have happened where we've had to like work on Achilles exercises and stuff, then we do that, but we back off the overall volume for the week. So any more questions about that? I think it's pretty specific to the race and specific to the race, specific to the terrain, specific to the athlete's fitness levels.
I asked because Zach Miller was putting up like 40 to 50K a week
He's
training for Hard
insane.
Rock in Colorado Springs. I was
Yeah.
just wondering if like there's a correlation because he was doing like 20K in a long run.
Yeah, I think that I saw that too. And I think that the difference is that Zach Miller is paid to run full time and he can spend 40 hours in the mountains. Whereas like people with full-time jobs that's impossible. Um, I mean, maybe not impossible, but very, very difficult. So it is, so like we saw at UTMB, right? The men's winner of the UTMB was the footwear developer for Hoka, who works a full-time job, who has a full-time life outside of full-time running. Being able to balance that is really challenging. Like that is not impossible, but rare and very challenging. So with Zach Miller, being able to do that kind of vert in the lead up for Hard Rock, like you kind of have to be able to do that kind of vert in the lead up to Hard Rock. But that is based on like years and years and years of running on that type of terrain, of racing those kinds of races and like building that foundation. So I hope that answers the question a little bit. Yeah, it's like, it's so individualized and it's so nuanced, but yeah, for us mere mortals, it's hard to run 40 hours a week in the mountains.
I feel like there's a tendency on like running podcasts to act like if you aren't going to get very specific amount of vert, like, before your big verti race, that you are going, it's not going to happen, right? And um, I mean, I obviously I won't speak for everyone, but I know my experience has always been like, oh yeah, it turns out that's all kind of bullshit. Like you can get less vert than that and you'll be okay. Um, and I think once I realized that it was like, oh, actually, I never really think about the big vert day that I had before a given race as like the thing that made me be successful or not successful, then I stopped caring as much.
Yeah. I think that there's definitely something to that too, because you can use it as a confidence booster, but it also like sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't, you know? So if it matters to you and you need that confidence booster, totally okay, totally fine and like helpful to use it that way. But also like we don't need to be running 40,000 feet of gain every week to finish a 100 miler. Just my 2 cents. Also, that's so much time. Oh, okay. So I guess when talking about this, like I want to chat a little bit about uphill treadmill sessions as well. Um, so with we had an athlete last week who did their first 100 miler in Steamboat Springs, and I incorporated a lot of uphill treadmill sessions and like uphill hikes for them in their prep for the race as doubles. So my intention of doing this was like I wanted an effective way to simulate race specific vert, especially when access to outdoor hills or climbing or trails was limited. So athletes who live in the city or who can't get to like a mountain, these are really, really helpful. So a lot of time using a treadmill within like 10 to 15% incline can mimic the cardiovascular and muscle demands of climbing without the technical challenges of trails, which is great because this improves leg strength, cardiovascular, wow, I can't say that word, cardiovascular efficiency. And it also helps with like the mental toughness that you need for extended climbs, right? So it's like that treadmill is never going down unless you hit the button. So you kind of just have to like set it, forget it, and hold on. But integrating these into training 1 to 2 times a week can definitely complement those long like outdoor vert sessions and balance overall volume. So if you're doing 2 tread hill sessions a week and like a vert focused long run, like you're going to be setting yourself up, but you're also going to be distributing that stress load, like that vert load pretty equally, sustainably throughout the week. So you're not just doing like a huge day at once and then not able to run for multiple days after. And then, so this is going to transition into the next question, which was, when creating a training program, what metrics are you using to determine how to best coach an athlete? Matt, this was your question. Your example was so perfect because the example is 2 marathon runners doing a fall marathon, but one's doing more speed and intensity and the other is doing more volume. So what in training indicates which athlete needs more of one versus the other? This answer is going to drive you crazy, but the answer is it depends. It depends on the athlete. It depends on fitness. It depends on, well, let's see. Okay, so it depends on your current fitness levels, right? So like volume load, like what you're used to, that's going to be very different athlete to athlete. Training load balance, weekly mileage, vert, speed work, endurance varies athlete to athlete. Your recovery makes a huge difference. So if you're like Matt, you've got a family, you've got lots of stuff going on. So like your HRV and sleep quality and overall fatigue is going to be very different from mine because I am
Definitely pretty low.
yeah. Well, I'm a childless cat lady, so it varies, right? So the other thing too is like race goals. If one athlete's marathon is their A goal and they have a set time, like that's awesome. The other athlete might just be like, I'm recovering from injury. I have no idea what to expect. I just want to go out and see if I feel good. That's going to change how each athlete is coached for the same race.
Yeah, I think we kind of covered this already, but like using me specifically, I've worked with coaches in the past where they were, saying like, hey, 40 miles a week, even 35 miles a week will get you to your goal. And then I've worked with other coaches that say, hey, like you're never going to hit your goal unless you're hitting 60, 65 miles a week. But there's really no metric that they're giving me as the answer other than like, that's going to get you there.
Yeah, that makes me really sad that you've had to
Not
experience.
not saying that's you, obviously.
No, I know.
Mine is tailored, but yeah, in the past for sure.
Yeah, but individualized training is what helps athletes like actually achieve their goals. I think is like I ran cross country and track in high school and in college. And now looking back at that, it's very interesting because it's like there was a base plan for everyone on the team. We were all doing the same workouts. We were all running about the same mileage. It was never structured individually. And a lot of people thrive in that environment and a lot of people don't because again, like fitness levels, recovery levels, fatigue levels, stress level, like all of that compounds and the effects of stress are like pretty mind-blowing. So having the same race with 2 different athletes and 2 very different training plans is like, in my experience with coaching for the last like lots of years, is like the best way to do it. So there's no one size fits all. There's no training plan. There's no way a coach should ever say if you're not
There's no
running.
magic formula.
Yeah, like
Okay.
never in 1,000 years should a coach ever say if you're not running 60 miles a week, you're not going to meet your goals because there are a lot of ways to the same place.
Gotcha. Cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think like all of these metrics and the things that I'm looking for as a coach too, like also previous injury history, overall stress, strength and weaknesses. Like if your ability to handle volume versus intensity differs, we're going to do more volume or we're going to do more intensity. And we're going to focus on the things that like boost your confidence, build speed. Like you'll see those improvements tracking over time. And then the feedback that I get as a coach as well. Like, did you like the workout? Did you hate the workout? Did you feel good? Did you feel like hot garbage? That's gonna dictate the next week of training or the next 2 weeks of training. Like if we need to add in a down week for more recovery time, we will. Like,
yeah.
So yeah.
Cool.
So
Thank you.
Yeah, add for a more personalized approach. Next question. This one I'm like, I was so happy this question was asked. How important is heart rate data? Like an example of like running in zone 2 versus just gauging how you feel. So this is the basic question of like heart rate versus rate of perceived exertion. And does it matter? Yes. Short answer is yes, it matters. But I'm going to go into like an explanation around heart rate and then an explanation around the RPE scale. So heart rate data, particularly in zone 2. I feel like it's like so hot right now to run in zone 2, but it's a really valuable training tool for building aerobic endurance and ensuring that you're training at the right intensity for those long-term adaptations. It can provide more objective feedback for a coach and for the athlete based on the effort. And running by heart rate zones can keep you from overtraining. So the caveat to this is that I think, like, how do I want to say that? The caveat to this is like your perceived effort, like gauging how you feel, is also incredibly important, especially as your body adapts with age. So like there is a formula for this, which is to determining your heart rate. Zones is like, 220 minus your age. That's your max heart rate. Like that is commonly used. It has been noted in recent studies that like that number is less and less reliable. There's another method that's useful, but its zones can like switch like with your age. So it depends, as you've noticed, Matt. But I think balancing your heart rate data with intuition and like how you feel in your body can give you like a more flexible, responsive approach, especially as you age. Yeah, so there's that. And then with the rate of perceived exertion, or the RPE scale, this can be just as effective, if not more. It's because it's more intuitive, and instead of relying solely on a number on your watch, especially as your body is changing over time, especially as like the amount of stress you're under. For women, it's like where you're at during like your menstrual cycle, that matters. Like so that's always going to change. Like it might feel a little bit more difficult in like the luteal phase than a different phase. So that just like being in tune with your body, like we talked about with the intuitive training, like the RPE scale is really good for that like body awareness. It also helps maintain a balance between like pushing your limits and staying within like appropriate like effort levels, regardless of age. So if you're the type of person who focuses a lot on the data, or if you have a certain pace in mind and you're not hitting it, that's gonna like trigger a mental like, oh shit, and it's like you're just kind of gonna spiral from there. So that's a really good way to like blow up a workout, or feel like you had a bad workout, even if the effort was there. Does anyone have questions about RPE versus heart rate? I know there's a lot of podcasts about it. There's a lot of research articles about it that I can share in the newsletter this week as well. But it kind of depends what you're looking for, what you're training for, and how you can respond and adapt and reframe to like not hitting a certain pace. Bueller, no.
So
If you're
yeah, I mean, you
doing,
should almost throw pace out the window though. Like if you're just going on RPE, right? And you're not focusing on heart rate zones,
Yeah.
it just should feel easy. Because like I was saying in the chat, I mean, looking at Maffetone, I mean, I would be in zone 3 or 4 for most of my easy runs, right? That actually feel easy and conversational. And as I get older, it's going to be even worse.
It might not get, it depends, but I think that like even with the RPE scale, you can use pace if the data doesn't affect you negatively, and you can give yourself a range. So if you know that like say like a 2 on the RPE scale, that for some athletes that might be an 8:30-minute mile, for 8:30 to like 9-minute mile. A 6 might be like a 5-minute to 6:30-minute mile. But that's always going to change. And I think that like if you can give yourself a range to like give yourself a little more grace and wiggle room in case you're not hitting those paces, you're going to be more likely to recover from like not hitting a pace, instead of feeling like you're the worst runner in the world and hot garbage and why am I even doing this. Like there's a lot of like psychology that goes into that too, because you're once you start to spiral, it's really hard to stop.
5-minute pace is like a 12 for me, just letting you know.
For most people, yeah.
If you use a heart rate model, should you be wearing a chest strap and should you like dial in those zones?
Yes, you
Like
definitely can dial in those zones.
how accurate is like Garmin? I don't know what their test is, but like, is that going to be accurate enough, or do you need to like have an actual study?
As a coach, I don't need the actual study. There are all sorts of tests that you can do. I guess like most recently, and like Chris, we talked a little bit about this last week with like the wrist-based heart rate monitors. Those are less reliable. Like it definitely depends on the model, on the most recent software update, on things like that. Wrist-based is less reliable than chest strap or even like the Coros armband. Like that's really accurate based off of like recent studies. But even if the wrist-based heart rate is unreliable, quote unquote, unreliable, as long as it's consistent, that's okay. So if it's telling you you're at a 70, and you're dying and it's like alerting you that you're too low, if it's 70 across the board, like across an hour long run, you're probably okay, even if that number is not correct. But it is possible to dial in your zones through like a lactate test, a VO2 max test. Those are about like $150 and they give you so much data. So it'll break down your zones specifically 1 through 5.
How do you feel about using the Garmin chest strap and the Garmin lactate threshold guided test on your watch?
I think that those are really cool. I think that data and that like information that's coming out is going to change the game for a lot of athletes, because if you can dial in your zones just at home using that like step-by-step process, you're going to be able to figure out what you should be running, and compare it to like what easy running feels like. Be like, oh, easy is a 9-minute mile. And then like, maybe my zone 3 is a little bit faster than I thought it was supposed to be. And so it can really help you dial in your training efforts if data is your thing. But if you're looking at your watch and it's telling you that you're not going fast enough, like that's probably long-term, like not super sustainable.
So like, let's say, like I probably go to a track to do that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Somewhere with like an objective distance.
But like there's nothing flat where I live. So like it's always like I'm going uphill or downhill, like no matter what. I have to drive half an hour to find a flat trail. So like my heart rate is always like high on the uphills. Like it's never just like straight up, here's a zone 2 run or RPE 3 run. Like that's unless I start walking, I feel like,
Yeah. And I think in that case specifically, like I think you should do that test on a track. Like like drive to the track, do the test so you have the numbers, but then also like be flexible with that, because altitude's going to make a difference. Going uphill is going to make a difference versus going downhill. Like that those numbers are going to fluctuate quite a bit based on where you live specifically. But having a general idea of those paces, I think will be helpful. And then again, comparing like what that pace is and how it feels in your body.
Cool.
Yeah. Sorry. I feel like a lot of the answers to this are like, it depends, which isn't really an answer, which is kind of frustrating, but it is so unique to each athlete. And that's kind of what makes it fascinating. It's like a, puzzle for everyone. Okay, let's see. I'm going to jump to runners who train with asthma. So I feel like there are a lot of athletes who use inhalers who have asthma, exercise-induced asthma, all of the things and the kinds of asthma. So I think that this is a really important question. Training for runners with asthma, their training plans are highly individualized, because asthma severity varies, from person to person. So like some athletes can benefit from like longer warm-ups and controlled breathing exercises to manage their symptoms, while like others need to adjust their entire training environment, like avoiding cold air or pollen, right? Like in Tucson, in the spring, like a lot of athletes here will only run on treadmills because the pollen from the Palo Verdes are so intense that like they can't walk across a parking lot without their eyes like, totally puffing up. So it depends on like the severity levels. But for this, like interval training for athletes with asthma can be really beneficial for building aerobic capacity while also allowing for recovery. So like you're basically gonna like microdose your training to see like what you can handle and then like build that capacity, if that makes sense. So like the key is to monitor your symptoms, obviously adapt as needed, and then just like base a lot of effort on how you feel. So the intensity and the volume should be adjusted based off of how the athlete responds to those environments. But then there's also the case of like medication for managing symptoms. So like for some runners, medication, like we talked about, like inhalers, crucial for managing these symptoms, right? But they should be based on the individual like medical guidance. So like I'm never going to tell you, or never should I ever tell you, because I'm not a doctor, like how many puffs of your inhaler you should have during the course of a day or a run. But cross training and like exercises like swimming or like low impact cross training in humid environments, like if you're on the elliptical, Ren, these exercises also help build fitness without exacerbating your asthma. So this is why like training plans can be really flexible for athletes with asthma, just to like help build fitness without pulling any triggers. But I think again, it depends. Like for East Coast athletes, the pollen count is going to be different for West Coast athletes and desert athletes and mountain athletes. Cool. And then the last training question is, how does training differ for a pregnant runner? This is a great question. So training for if an athlete is pregnant, we're going to start focusing on adaptations rather than performance. Like you're not going to, I don't think a good goal during any pregnancy is to like PR your half marathon time. It's like probably not safe. There are different, like based on the trimester, there are a lot of like guardrails you should stay within. And so communicating efficiently, effectively, and often with your medical provider is like the best bet. So you're like throughout this whole process, like your goal is going to shift from like pushing limits to maintaining that base level of fitness, improving mental well-being, and like preparing for postpartum recovery. So the intensity of your training block, the intensity of like volume is going to reduce. Effort's often going to be gauged on using the RPE scale. Because, and we're going to use the RPE scale more during training while pregnant because your heart rate can fluctuate so much due to hormonal changes. So, I just want to like add that in there because that's really important too. So heart rate training's off the table if you're pregnant. And then we're going to add in more cross training, strength work, particularly around like deep core, pelvic floor. Those things are going to become critical to support your body's like the body through pregnancy, because the physical demands of pregnancy are insane. And then with that, like rest, flexibility, and training that's all going to be equally important. So a couple things that should be considered when training during pregnancy, and this is one of those like it depends answers again, but like again, intensity is going to be scaled down. A lot of the efforts you're going to be training at are going to be like conversational pace, right? Like really, really chill. And then we can focus more on like listening to your body, but also working with a strength trainer, working working with a PT who specializes in pelvic floor strength, that's all going to be like really, really important and really specific to like where you're at in the pregnancy. So you can also like work with nutritionists, talk to them about like hydration, nutrition, how these things need to be monitored as like your body's demand increases throughout the pregnancy. But everything's basically going to be modified, especially when we start accounting for like the shifting center of gravity that you have. There's a lot that goes into this. And if you want me to, like, I feel like I could do like a whole presentation on just like training while pregnant. So there's so many things to consider here. But basically, I would say find a PT that specializes in pelvic floor and focus on deep core exercises that combine with pelvic floor exercises. But also, like, we're going to reduce volume significantly, and we're not going to train by heart rate because it's going to be a roller coaster for a while. Okay. Next question. Ooh, we might not get through all of these, but this question I think is really important because we've got 2 athletes training for marathons that are coming up real fast and they're entering the taper phase. So are phantom pains a real thing? Yes. Yes, they are. And they're awful. Okay, so this is called somatic anxiety. So there's cognitive anxiety, which is like when your brain starts spiraling out of control and you're playing the what if game and you're like so in your head. Somatic anxiety is in your body. So as your body shifts into recovery mode and the intensity of your weekly volume decreases, it's really common to become hyper aware of like every sensation and interpreting these things as like, instead of interpreting them as like normal adjustments, it's really easy to confuse them as like a potential injury, right? And like Jacob, we talked a lot about this in your build up to Leadville, especially during the taper phase, and we talked about it a lot during Black Canyon training as well. Like both of us were like, "What is this?" You know, there was a lot going on, but these are very real things, and I think the best way to explain this, the physiological explanation, is that there's a combination of like your nervous system trying to regulate and your muscles are trying to recover. And so like as your body shifts from high intensity training or like more volume to lower volume, it starts repairing the micro damage from previous workouts. So that can create sensations of like tightness or discomfort. And that's triggering the sympathetic nervous system, which heightens your sensitivity to physical sensations.
So when you're in the thick of training, it just doesn't repair itself. It just says, all right, we're going to do this again.
It does, but you're less aware of it. So during the taper phase, because you're doing less physical work, you're not like you're more hyper aware of like how you're feeling in your body.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So totally normal. But again, it's easy to confuse like the discomfort with fears or maybe feelings of like potential injury. So I would say, you know, like we've talked about, Matt, like wrap yourself in bubble wrap and just get to the start line, but also like make sure you're taking care of yourself. There again, foam rolling, good nutrition, good sleep, low stress, things like that. And then just be like careful with yourself. And like, I think one good rule of thumb is like every ache and pain is not like an injury. But if there is something that's like sharp versus dull and achy, like we need to pay a little more attention to like the sharp pains.
Yeah, and the lead up to my last marathon, like 2 days before the race, my back started to hurt real bad. But then like on race day, it was not there at all.
Yeah, that's a really good example of this kind of somatic anxiety. And like a lot of people call it the taper tantrums because people's like moods change a lot because you're so used to regulating on high high volume or like more mileage. And then once you don't have that to do, it's kind of like a kid who like doesn't get enough recess time, right? And they're just like terrorists sitting in class, like talking back to the teacher and stuff. So
Interesting.
it's a whole phenomenon.
Yeah, I would think you'd have the opposite and just feel amazing.
Yeah. One thing that I talked to Jacob about a lot is basically like the worse your taper feels, the better the race should be.
Oh,
Theoretically.
okay. There you go.
That's how I like to think about it. So if it feels terrible, the race should go really well.
I feel like every like injury or like I've had inflammatory symptoms, like all the things I've had in the last 6 months is all happening this week. And it's like, all right, everything hurts. Let's go.
So you know you're ready.
Good to know.
Yeah. We did not get through all of these, but I do want to be cognizant of time because I know people have like work schedules, work meetings. So maybe we'll save the ones that we didn't hit for the next Q&A, but I really enjoyed doing this. And I think that like, I hope you guys enjoyed it too. I know that there's a lot of information out there and there's a lot of ways to like find conflicting information, but also finding like information that aligns. So I think, yeah, the best way to sort of dive into these is to talk about them. And the research is always going to be changing. There's always going to be like a new hype training. Like, you know, people are going to have a lot of different ways to get to the same place, but science is cool, research is cool, and we'll just try to stay on top of it as much as possible. So yeah, and then again, if you have any other questions, drop them into the Slack channel because we'll just save them and then address them for future calls. So next week we will likely do a team show and tell, which is like my favorite. And then the following week we're going to talk to Jeremy Hendricks about shoes and picking out the right shoe.